November 6, 1895. Inside St. Thomas Church in New York City, 2,000 guests watched as the most beautiful heiress in America walked down the aisle of a wedding dress that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 years old, stunning and crying. Not tears of joy, tears of absolute despair. Because this wasn't a wedding. It was a transaction, a sale. Her mother had literally sold her to the Duke of Marlborough for $2.5 million under British title. And as Consuelo stood at that altar, dressed in white satin and Brussels lace, she wasn't thinking about the Duke waiting for her. She was thinking about the man she truly loved, the man her mother had forbidden her to see, threatened her to forget, and destroyed her soul to keep her from marrying. This is the story of the cruelest mother-daughter betrayal in American history. Have you ever been forced to choose between your own happiness and your family's expectations? Have you ever felt trapped by circumstances you couldn't control, pressured into decisions that would destroy your future? For most of us, these are difficult moments that pass. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, it was her entire life. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about wealth and privilege. It's a story about control, manipulation, and what happens when a mother's ambition matters more than her daughter's humanity. It's about a young woman who had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered most: freedom. If you're interested in real stories that reveal the darkness behind gilded facades, the human cost of social ambition, and the strength it takes to survive when your own mother becomes your enemy, then you need to hear Consuelo's complete story. And if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because what happened to Consuelo Vanderbilt wasn't just tragic, it was a crime disguised as a fairy tale. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2, 1877, into unimaginable wealth. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was one of the richest men in America. Her mother, Alva, was the daughter of a Confederate cotton broker who had lost everything in the Civil War, and that loss would shape Alva into one of the most ruthless social climbers in American history and seal her daughter's fate. From the moment Consuelo was born, Alva saw her not as a child to be loved, but as an investment. A beautiful daughter with the Vanderbilt fortune could marry into European aristocracy, could bring home a title that would place the Vanderbilt name among nobility. It was an obsession that would consume Alva and destroy Consuelo. Consuelo's childhood was torture disguised as preparation. While other girls played freely, Consuelo was strapped into steel back braces to ensure perfect posture. She was forced to lie on hard wooden boards instead of comfortable mattresses. She spent hours with her head pressed against walls to elongate her neck. Alva believed beauty and bearing were everything, and she would torture her daughter to achieve perfection. The physical torture was only part of it. Alva controlled every aspect of Consuelo's life with iron-fisted tyranny. She chose Consuelo's clothes, friends, activities, thoughts. She monitored conversations, read mail, allowed no privacy whatsoever. She criticized constantly her daughter's posture, voice, expressions, her very existence never quite good enough. Despite this suffocating control, Consuelo grew into a remarkable young woman. She was breathtakingly beautiful, tall, delicate features, enormous dark eyes, and natural grace despite the rigid training. She was intelligent, thoughtful, possessed quiet strength her mother couldn't completely crush. She spoke multiple languages fluently, loved art and literature, and somewhere in the prison of her controlled existence, Consuelo held on to hope that someday she might choose her own destiny, love whom she wanted, live a life that was truly hers. In 1893, Alva divorced William Kissam in a scandal that shocked society. The divorce gave Alva the magnificent marble house in Newport, but she'd lost the automatic social position of being Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. She needed a new plan to cement her position at society's pinnacle. and that plan centered entirely on Consuelo. Alva had decided years earlier that Consuelo would marry a European duke. Nothing less would do. American millionaires might be rich, but European aristocrats had something money couldn't buy: centuries of lineage, ancient titles, acceptance by true nobility. If Consuelo married a duke, Alva would become a duchess's mother. It was the ultimate social achievement, and Alva would let nothing stand in her way. But in the summer of 1804, 17-year-old Consuelo did the most dangerous thing possible. She fell in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford Winty to his friends. He was tall, handsome, charming, from an old, respected New York family. By any reasonable standard, he was an excellent match. But he had three fatal flaws in Alva's eyes. He was American, he had no title, and he wasn't part of Alva's plan. The moment Alva discovered Consuelo's feelings for Winty, war was declared, not openly. Alva was calculating. Instead, she began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to separate the young lovers and break her daughter's will completely. She forbade Consuelo from seeing Winthrop, monitored her constantly, intercepted their letters. When that wasn't enough, Alva made a threat that revealed her true nature. She told Consuelo that, if she continued to see Winthrop, Alva would shoot him dead. She said it calmly. A simple fact. She would kill the man Consuelo loved rather than allow her daughter to marry him. Consuelo was 18 years old, trapped with a mother who just threatened murder, being pushed toward a marriage with a man she'd never met. She tried to resist. She begged her father for help, writing desperate letters, asking him to intervene. But William K. Vanderbilt, for all his money and power, was terrified of his ex-wife. He told Consuelo there was nothing he could do. She was alone, facing a mother who saw her as property to be sold, not a person to be loved. And across the Atlantic, a young English duke desperately needed American money to save his crumbling ancestral estate. The trap was closing, and Consuelo Vanderbilt, despite her intelligence and strength, couldn't see any way out. Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 23 years old and drowning in debt. Known as Sonny because of his courtesy title, the Earl of Sunderland, he'd inherited one of England's most prestigious titles and one of England's greatest financial disasters. Blenheim Palace, his ancestral home, was magnificent and falling apart. Built in the early 1700s as a gift to the first Duke of Marlborough or his military victories, Blenheim was one of the largest private residences in England, a Baroque masterpiece with over 180 rooms on thousands of acres. It was the birthplace of Winston Churchill, who would be Sonny's cousin. It was a national treasure. It was also crumbling. The roof leaked everywhere. Windows were broken. Walls were deteriorating. The grounds were overgrown. Annual maintenance costs exceeded the estate's income by staggering amounts. Sonny's father had neglected the property for years, spending money on mistresses and gambling, while Blenheim slowly rotted. Now Sonny faced a choice confronting aristocrats across Europe: marry an American heiress with millions, or watch centuries of family heritage collapse into dust. Sonny wasn't a villain. He was a product of his class and era, a young man trained to believe that maintaining his family's position and property was the highest duty. He believed in the British aristocratic system, in honor and duty and tradition. He wasn't cruel by nature. But he was willing to marry a woman he'd never met, to essentially purchase a bride, if it meant saving Blenheim. The system bringing American heiresses and British aristocrats together was well established by the 1890s. Dozens of young American women had already married into European nobility, trading their fathers millions for titles. Matchmakers operated openly, creating lists of available dukes and earls like livestock at auction. The deals were negotiated like business contracts, because that's exactly what they were. When Alva Vanderbilt began looking for a suitable European husband for Consuelo, the Duke of Marlborough topped her list. His title was among England's most prestigious. His family history was impeccable. His property was legendary. The fact that he desperately needed money only made him more perfect. He would be motivated to agree to Alva's terms. In summer 1894, Alva engineered their first meeting. She arranged for herself and Consuelo to visit London during the social season, securing invitations to exclusive events. And she ensured the Duke would be introduced to her daughter at precisely the right moment. The meeting was awkward and formal. Sonny was stiff and reserved in the British aristocratic manner. Consuelo, still dreaming of Winthrop Rutherford, found Sonny cold and uninteresting. They had virtually nothing in common. She loved art and music and intellectual conversation. He loved hunting, political duty, and maintaining estates. She was warm and empathetic. He was rigid and emotionally distant. But Alva saw what she wanted, a duke who needed money, and a daughter who would provide it. Now she just needed to make it happen. The only obstacle was Consuelo's heart. Throughout late 1894, Alva became increasingly aware that Consuelo's feelings for Winthrop weren't fading. The young couple found ways to exchange letters despite Alva's surveillance. They met secretly when possible. Their love was growing stronger, and Alva realized she needed drastic action. In early 1895, Alva announced Consuelo would spend summer in Europe, ostensibly for culture and education, actually to push the Duke toward a proposal. She made certain Winthrop couldn't follow. She used her social connections to make clear that any attempt by Winty to pursue Consuelo would result in his complete social destruction. And then Alva revealed the full extent of her ruthlessness. She told Consuelo that, if she refused to marry the Duke, Alva would shoot Winthrop dead. She said it calmly, as fact. She would kill the man Consuelo loved rather than allow her daughter to defy her. Consuelo was 18, trapped in a foreign country, with a mother who'd threatened murder, being pushed toward marriage with a man she barely knew and didn't love. She begged her father for help. William K. Vanderbilt told her there was nothing he could do. In July 1895, the Duke formally proposed to Consuelo at a garden party at Marble House in Newport. The proposal was as romantic as a business transaction. Sonny got down on one knee, produced a ring, and asked Consuelo to be his wife in a tone suggesting he was fulfilling an obligation rather than declaring love. Consuelo looked at this cold, stiff Englishman kneeling before her. She thought of Winthrop. She thought of her mother's threats. She thought of the complete absence of escape. And she said yes, not because she wanted to, but because she believed she had no choice. The engagement was announced with great fanfare. Newspapers declared it the match of the decade. The Duke would receive millions. Alva would get her duchess. Everyone celebrated. Everyone except Consuelo, who cried herself to sleep that night and every night after, mourning the death of her dreams and the beginning of a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. The months between the engagement in July and the wedding in November should have been the happiest time in a young woman's life. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, they were a descent into psychological torture that would leave scars lasting decades. Alva threw herself into wedding preparations with ruthless efficiency. Every detail had to be perfect, had to prove the Vanderbilts were worthy of their aristocratic connection. The cost was irrelevant. Alva would spend whatever it took. But while Alva obsessed over details, Consuelo was quietly dying inside. She went through the motions like a prisoner awaiting execution. She stood for dress fittings without protest. She smiled for photographers without feeling. She accepted congratulations from people who had no idea they were celebrating a human sacrifice. The wedding dress alone was worth more than most houses. Created by the House of Worth in Paris, it required hundreds of hours of labor. The fabric was ivory satin overlaid with Brussels lace that had taken years to create. The train stretched 18 feet, requiring multiple attendants. The veil was held by a diamond tiara. Every element was designed to prove American wealth could buy anything, including the perfect bride for a British duke. But beneath that exquisite dress was a young woman in absolute agony. In the final weeks before the wedding, Consuelo made one last desperate attempt to escape. She went to her mother and begged, actually got down on her knees and begged, to be released from the engagement. She told Alva the truth, that she didn't love the Duke, that she loved Winthrop, that forcing this marriage would destroy her happiness forever. Alva's response revealed the full depth of her monstrosity. She told Consuelo she was being selfish and ungrateful. She reminded her of the threats against Winthrop, and then Alva played her cruelest card. She told Consuelo that if the wedding didn't proceed, Alva would die. She claimed to have a weak heart and said the shame of a cancelled wedding would literally kill her. Consuelo, 18, and psychologically shattered by years of manipulation, believed her. She couldn't escape without causing Winthrop's death or her mother's death. The trap was complete. Consuelo did something extraordinary then. She wrote a letter to the Duke telling him the truth. She explained she didn't love him, that she loved someone else, that she was being forced into marriage against her will. She begged him, as a gentleman, to release her. The Duke's response was devastatingly revealing. He acknowledged her honesty. He even expressed some sympathy. But he also made clear that he needed her money desperately, that Blenheim was crumbling, that his duty to his family outweighed any consideration of her happiness or his own. He would not release her. The wedding would proceed. November 6, 1895, dawned cold and grey. Inside the Vanderbilt mansion, Consuelo was dressed in her magnificent gown by attendants who thought they were preparing a radiant bride. In reality, they were dressing a sacrifice. Consuelo later described that morning as surreal, as if she were watching herself from outside her body. She felt numb, disconnected. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a beautiful stranger in white satin and diamonds, but a stranger nonetheless. When it was time to leave for St. Thomas Church, Consuelo couldn't stop crying. Not gentle tears, harsh, bitter sobs that wouldn't stop. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face blotchy. The carefully applied makeup was ruined. Alva was furious, not because her daughter was in agony, but because Consuelo's tears might ruin the perfect image. She ordered the attendants to fix Consuelo's face. And when Consuelo still couldn't stop crying, Alva told her to stop being dramatic and think of the Duke's feelings instead of her own. The carriage ride to St. Thomas Church was one of the longest journeys of Consuelo's life. She sat beside her father, who was to walk her down the aisle. William knew exactly what was happening. He knew his daughter was being forced into a loveless marriage, and he did nothing. He was too afraid of his ex-wife, too concerned with avoiding scandal, too weak to save his own child. St. Thomas Church was packed with 2,000 guests, the cream of society, all there to witness the wedding of the century. The church blazed with thousands of flowers and candles. The organ played triumphant music, and through it all, Consuelo cried. As she walked down that endless aisle on her father's arm, she cried. As she stood before the bishop, she cried. As the Duke took her hand, his grip cold and formal, she cried. Many guests noticed. How could they not? The bride was openly weeping throughout the ceremony, her shoulders shaking. But society chose to interpret her tears as emotion, as overwhelming joy. They saw what they wanted to see, what Alva needed them to see. Only a few understood the truth. A few recognized this wasn't a wedding. It was a transaction being completed, a sale being finalized, but no one intervened, no one objected, no one saved Consuelo Vanderbilt from her fate. The ceremony was mercifully short. The bishop spoke the ancient words. Consuelo and the Duke made their vows, his voice clear, hers barely audible, choked with tears. Rings were exchanged. The bishop pronounced them man and wife. It was done. Consuelo Vanderbilt was now the Duchess of Marlborough, And as the Duke led her back down the aisle, past 2,000 smiling faces who had just witnessed the destruction of a young woman's life, Consuelo felt something inside her die. Hope, perhaps, or innocence, or the belief that love and happiness were possible for someone like her. That night, married to a man she didn't love, trapped in a life she'd never wanted, Consuelo Vanderbilt cried herself to sleep, just as she would cry herself to sleep on countless nights to come. If Consuelo had harbored any hope that her new life might offer escape or discovery of happiness, those hopes died the moment she arrived at Blenheim Palace in December 1895. The magnificent estate was spectacular, and spectacularly soul-crushing. Blenheim was enormous, cold, and crumbling. The palace had over 180 rooms, but only a fraction were heated adequately. Winter winds howled through gaps in window frames. The roof leaked, requiring strategic buckets to catch rainwater. Grandeur that impressed visitors revealed itself as decay up close. But physical discomfort was nothing compared to emotional isolation. The Duke treated Consuelo with formal politeness more painful than outright cruelty. He wasn't abusive. He didn't rage or threaten. He was simply cold, distant, utterly uninterested in his wife as a person. She was a solution to his financial problems, a walking bank account beautiful enough to display at social functions. The marriage settlement was staggering. $2.5 million in railway stock transferred immediately to the Duke, equivalent to roughly $85 million today. Additionally, Consuelo would receive an annual income of $100,000. This money would flow to the Duke for Blenheim's endless repairs. The Duke took Vanderbilt money and poured it into Blenheim with obsession bordering on madness. He hired architects, engineers, and craftsmen to restore the palace. He lavished attention on his beloved estate, while giving his wife almost nothing beyond polite acknowledgement of her existence. Consuelo's life at Blenheim settled into suffocating routine. She managed over 40 servants who looked at her with either pity or resentment. She entertained the Duke's aristocratic friends, sitting through endless formal dinners where conversation was stilted and boring. She performed her duties as Duchess of Marlborough, but she was desperately lonely. The Duke's family and friends treated her with polite condescension. She was American, therefore not truly one of them. No matter how perfect her manners, how fluent her conversation, she remained an outsider. The bought American heiress who'd saved Blenheim with vulgar new money. The Duke expected heirs. That was part of the bargain. Consuelo fulfilled that duty with the same resignation she brought to everything else. In September 1897, she gave birth to a son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill. In November 1898, she gave birth to another son, Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill. Motherhood gave Consuelo something she desperately needed: purpose and genuine love. She adored her sons with intensity her own mother had never shown her. She poured into them all the affection she'd been denied. She was determined her sons would grow up knowing they were loved unconditionally, but even motherhood couldn't fill the void in her marriage. Providing heirs only made the Duke more distant. He had what he needed: money to save Blenheim and sons to continue the line. Beyond that, she held little interest. He spent his time managing estates, pursuing his political career, involving himself in projects that systematically excluded his wife. By 1900, 5 years into the marriage, Consuelo and Sonny barely spoke beyond what was required for public appearances. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives under the same massive roof. They were courteous in public and cold in private. The marriage was a hollow shell, maintained for appearances, but devoid of connection. Consuelo began finding small rebellions, tiny ways to assert her identity and reclaim some agency. She threw herself into charitable work, founding organizations to help the poor. She studied art and architecture seriously, developing genuine expertise. She became involved in women's suffrage, supporting the movement despite the Duke's disapproval and her mother's horror. These activities gave Consuelo something to live for beyond duty. They connected her to causes larger than herself, to people who valued her for who she was rather than what she represented. And slowly, gradually, Consuelo began finding her own strength, not strength to escape yet, but strength to endure without being completely destroyed. By the early 1900s, everyone who knew the Duke and Duchess understood their marriage was a disaster. They maintained the facade beautifully, appearing together at social functions, standing side by side in photographs, performing their roles with practiced precision. But anyone paying attention could see the truth in Consuelo's eyes. This wasn't a woman living a fairy tale. This was a woman serving a life sentence in a gilded prison, and in quiet moments, Consuelo would calculate. She was 23 years old. She had potentially 5 or 6 more decades ahead. 5 or 6 more decades in this loveless marriage, in this cold palace, playing this hollow role. The thought was almost unbearable, but something was changing inside her. The woman who'd cried through her wedding ceremony was gradually transforming into someone stronger, more determined, more willing to fight for her own happiness. Because Consuelo had finally realized something crucial, her mother had lied about everything. And if Alva had lied to force her into this marriage, then Consuelo had no moral obligation to stay in it forever. For 11 years, Consuelo endured. She played her role as Duchess with grace that impressed even harsh critics. She raised her sons, managed Blenheim, supported the Duke's ambitions, and performed her duties flawlessly. But beneath that perfect surface, she was changing. The woman who'd been manipulated and controlled was becoming someone who would no longer accept that treatment. Because Consuelo had realized her mother's threats had been lies, Alva hadn't had a weak heart. Winthrop hadn't forgotten her. The Duke hadn't needed to marry for money quite as desperately as claimed. Every threat, every ultimatum had been either a lie or grotesque exaggeration. And that realization changed everything. The Duke was also changing. As Blenheim was restored with Vanderbilt money, and his political career flourished with Vanderbilt connections, Sonny became increasingly arrogant and openly contemptuous. He no longer bothered with basic courtesy in private. He made clear he viewed Consuelo as a necessary inconvenience, valuable only for her money and for producing heirs. Then, in 1906, something happened that pushed Consuelo toward action. She met Jacques Bolson, a French aviator and businessman. Jacques was charming, warm, genuinely interested in Consuelo as a person. For the first time in over a decade, Consuelo felt truly seen. Not as a duchess, not as a Vanderbilt heiress, but as Consuelo. Their relationship began as friendship and slowly evolved into something deeper. For Consuelo, Jacques represented something crucial, proof that her capacity for love and happiness hadn't been completely destroyed. Proof that there was still hope for a different kind of life. Meanwhile, the Duke had fallen in love, or what passed for love in his emotionally stunted world, with Gladys Deacon, a beautiful American. Sonny made little effort to hide his infatuation, humiliating Consuelo publicly by paying obvious attention to Gladys while ignoring his wife. By 1907, the marriage had become completely intolerable. Consuelo and Sonny fought bitterly. The cold politeness gave way to open hostility. They couldn't stand to be in the same room. The facade was cracking. Consuelo made a decision that would have been unthinkable when she was 18. She would leave. She would separate from the Duke, would stop playing her role as perfect duchess, would reclaim her own life no matter the cost. In 1907, she moved out of Blenheim Palace and rented Sunderland House in London, taking her sons with her. The separation was scandalous. Newspapers covered it extensively. Some blamed Consuelo for abandoning her duties. Others blamed the Duke for his cold treatment and obvious affair. But everyone agreed the marriage of the century had become the divorce scandal of the decade. Alva was furious, not because her daughter was unhappy, but because the scandal reflected badly on Alva herself. She initially tried to force Consuelo back to Blenheim, using the same manipulation tactics that had worked when Consuelo was 18. But Consuelo was no longer 18. She was 30 years old, a mother of 2 sons she would protect fiercely, and a woman who'd finally learned to say no. When Alva threatened, Consuelo stood firm. When Alva tried using the sons as leverage, Consuelo fought back legally. When Alva attempted to turn society against her, Consuelo found allies. The battle between mother and daughter that had been brewing for 3 decades finally erupted into open warfare. And for the first time, Consuelo was winning, because she'd discovered something powerful. She didn't need her mother's approval anymore. She needed her freedom and self-respect, and she was willing to fight for both. The legal separation was finalized in 1907, but divorce was more complicated. In England at that time, divorce was difficult and scandalous. The Duke didn't want one. It would create scandal and jeopardize his political career. But Consuelo was determined. The battle lasted years. Finally, in 1920, 25 years after that devastating wedding, Consuelo received her divorce decree. The Duke was free to marry Gladys Deacon, which he did almost immediately, and Consuelo was free to finally live her own life. In 1921, at age 44, Consuelo married Jacques Bolson in a quiet ceremony, bearing no resemblance to her first wedding. No 2,000 guests, no $100,000 dress, no drama. Just 2 people who genuinely loved each other, choosing to build a life together. The marriage was happy, companionable, and lasted until Jacques' death in 1956. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came in 1926, when the Catholic Church granted her an annulment of her marriage to the Duke. The grounds were simple. She had been forced into marriage against her will. The Church acknowledged officially what Consuelo had been saying for decades, that the wedding of the century had been a farce, a coerced union that never should have happened. The annulment meant that in the eyes of the Church, and symbolically, in moral terms, Consuelo's marriage to the Duke had never truly existed. The prison sentence her mother imposed was officially ended. Consuelo lived until 1964, dying at age 87, a long life that transcended the tragedy of her youth. In 1953, she published her memoirs, The Glitter and the Gold, and told her truth with devastating honesty. She described her mother's cruelty in detail, explained the torture of her upbringing, revealed the threats and manipulation, exposed the Duke's coldness and the marriage's emptiness. Alva died in 1933, still proud of forcing her daughter into an aristocratic marriage, still believing she'd done the right thing. She never acknowledged the damage, never apologized, never accepted that her social ambition had destroyed her daughter's happiness. But Consuelo's story had a different ending. She lived to see her sons grow into good men. She experienced genuine happiness in her second marriage. She became known for charitable work and support of women's rights. She lived long enough to see society's attitudes change, to see women gain more autonomy. And perhaps most importantly, she told her story. She made certain the world understood what had really happened behind the fairy tale facade. She exposed the cruelty of social ambition, the damage caused by treating children as commodities, the human cost of buying and selling people. Today, Blenheim Palace still stands as a magnificent tourist attraction, but few know the full story of the American girl who was sold to save it, whose tears on her wedding day were misinterpreted as joy, whose life was sacrificed on the altar of her mother's social ambition. On November 6, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt walked down the aisle crying tears of despair, believing her life was over at 18. But her life wasn't over. It was just beginning. The fairy tale wedding was a nightmare, but the real story, How she survived, fought back, and won her freedom. That was her triumph. Consuelo Vanderbilt was sold to a duke, but she bought herself back, and in doing so, she left a legacy far more valuable than any fortune or title. The lesson that freedom and authentic living are worth fighting for, no matter how long the battle takes. That lesson echoes across generations. You are not powerless, you are not owned, and your life belongs to you.